Thanks very much for the kind words of introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. Thanks for coming out tonight. 200 years ago, the United States went to war. The group that was driving American politics at that moment was known as the War Hawks, the original War Hawks, led by Henry Clay, who was Speaker of the House of Representatives. They were belligerent, they wanted a confrontation, they got one with Great Britain. And they didn't want to pay for it. They didn't want to raise taxes. They also didn't believe in the national debt. They had abolished the first bank of the United States in the run-up to the war. It was not a central bank, but it was a prototype public debt manager. This war did not go well for the United States on many fronts. They hadn't funded the military. They didn't have a strong navy. And in the summer of 1814, the British seized control of the Chesapeake Bay area. They invaded the American mainland, took control of Washington, D.C., and burned every single official building in Washington, including the White House. The British came to the Treasury, they broke down the doors, and they smashed open every strongbox. And the only good news for the Americans was there was nothing in it. We were broke. And this, for those of you who keep track of the details, and the details are very important, this was not a default. The US didn't miss a payment on its debt, but it didn't have the capacity to fund its government. This was a fiscal disaster as complete as any fiscal disaster that you will see in the near future, and I believe you will see some. So the question before us this evening, the question we address in the book, the question we're here to talk with you about is, will this happen again? Will the United States have some version of a fiscal calamity, a slow one or a fast one, a European-style one or our own homegrown American one? We are an exceptional country. And how do we avoid it? What do we need to do? How difficult is it to pull back from not just the fiscal cliff and all these other discussions you've heard, the immediate cry for political attention and the drama you'll see at the end of this year, but how hard is it to pull back from a bigger, more serious fiscal cliff and put this country back where it used to be, which was absolutely among the most fiscally responsible nations? To address that question, I'll say a few things about history, both distant history, on which I think we can all pretty much agree, more recent history, where there may be some disagreements, and then I'll turn it over to James, who will talk about what needs to be done. And I should tell you two things. First of all, he only has unpalatable truths and unpopular recommendations. And secondly, I'll be sneaking out the back while he's talking. So, no. It's a difficult conversation. It always has been. And the first point, the most important point is, we've been here before. In fact, the people who founded this country had exactly the same issue at the very beginning. Alexander Hamilton was an aide, one of the most important aides to General George Washington, spent most of the War of Independence writing letters to the Continental Congress saying, please send money, please send shoes, please send anything you can. The Continental Congress didn't have the power of taxation. There was no federal government in a modern sense, and they struggled, the Americans struggled in the War of Independence for exactly that reason. After the War of Independence, the US was in default on its debts. The country was born in default. People like Hamilton and James Madison got together and decided that this was not the right basis on which to build an economy. They persuaded their colleagues to call a constitutional convention, and the key breakthrough there was to establish the right of the federal government to tax and to issue public debt, although Hamilton's specific implementation of that was controversial. He had a big falling out with Jefferson and with Madison over that. And the interesting thing about the War of 1812 and that debacle was it was totally unnecessary in retrospect, because Hamilton had already put in place a robust public finance system, central taxes, issue debt when you need it at a time of emergency, and then bring that debt down subsequent to the emergency, but in a gradual fashion relative to the size of the economy. That system was not liked by Jefferson and Madison. It fell into disrepair. The war hawks pushed it aside, and they faced the consequences. After the War of 1812, there was agreement, very broad agreement in this country across the political spectrum, that you needed to implement a version of Hamilton's system. Fiscal responsibility, as designed by Hamilton, representing his version of the intent of the Constitution, was the right basis for a modern economy. Now, you can still argue about Alexander Hamilton. It's a great thing about this country. I think we'll be having the same debates that Hamilton and Jefferson had from now until the end of the Republic, which I hope will be a very long time from now. So we can argue those details for sure, and we take that up in the book. But you can't argue with the fact that from the War of 1812 until recently, this country was carefully run in terms of public finances. There have been 6 increases in debt in the United States, big ones, big debt surges. Independence, War of 1812, Civil War, World War I, World War II, first 5, all wars. And after the War of 1812, they used the Hamilton system. World War II, the biggest debt surge on record. The US goes from a small military in 1940 to one of the largest military efforts the world has ever seen in the space of 2 years. Financed initially by debt, and then by increasing taxes, and then by bringing the debt down gradually in a strong growth environment after the war. Not precipitate austerity. The 6th debt surge, of course, is the more recent one and the most difficult one. And it wasn't, yes, there was a war element, the 2 foreign wars, Iraq and Afghanistan. Wars are expensive. But that wasn't the main driver of the increase in debt. And yes, there was a tax cut. There was the perception at the end of the 1990s that taxes could and should be cut, that the budget was in surplus. Something perhaps of an overstatement. But there was that perception, and taxes were cut. And those taxes, those so-called Bush-era tax cuts, but I would now call them the Bush-Obama tax cuts because they've been extended under President Obama. That was his proposal, actually, to extend them. Those tax cuts are an important part of the agenda that we need to talk with you about this evening, and they may be the most difficult part of the conversation. And it was Medicare, a little bit of it, honestly, was also Medicare Part D, a public policy program that you may support. We're actually some of the biggest supporters of Medicare that you'll find in the public policy arena today in the United States. But you have to pay for it, and Medicare Part D was not funded. But the big surge in debt, the real reason the debt is front and center of the political agenda, the reason there will be a debilitating debate and fight over this in Congress. There was one last year in the summer. There'll be one again this year, probably towards the end of the year. We'll see. The reason is very simple. It's the financial crisis. That financial crisis, the explosion of the banks, the damage that did to the real economy, it's calculated by the Congressional Budget Office. And to be clear, I'm on their panel of economic advisors, but these are their numbers, not my numbers. They calculate that the final impact of that financial crisis on debt relative to the size of the economy, debt to GDP, which is the key measure here, look at the whole time scale of the economy going down and then what we still hope will be a recovery, a slow recovery it seems, but hopefully a full recovery. The additional debt you will have, we will have, 50% of GDP, or let's call that $7.5 trillion in today's money. It's colossal. Second largest debt shock in American history, second only to World War II. And I know what we got from World War II. I know what we achieved. I know what the world became like after 1945. I don't know what any of us got from the excessive risk-taking, the mismanagement, and the calamity brought on this country and spread around the world by huge financial institutions in the run-up to 2008.